Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathsala. Today we are going to discuss development communication, whether it is a philanthropy or tyranny. This lecture is part of your paper Development Communication. This lecture deals with the concept of internationalizing development communication. You have already had an idea what is meant by development communication and its different theories in some of the previous lectures. Review of development literature suggests that developed nations acquired and applied technological knowledge much faster than the developing nations. Technological knowledge emerged most authoritatively in Europe, that was encouraged by the rise of merchant class. Such dominion placed it over other nations in terms of capital and power. After studying this lecture, you'll be having a clarity on understanding of the notion of internationalization of development communication. Further, it will also help in mapping the emergence of theory and practice of development communication around the world. International perspective of development communication or development mediations are not new, and the modern concept of development communication dates back to the era of Second World War. There had been colonization of most of the third world nations post the World War II, and it was followed by the establishment of United Nations and its several multilateral agencies, marking the onset of development in the underdeveloped countries. Soon after, a number of bilateral agencies were formed within the industrialized Western countries. International development theorists have conceptualized development from different perspectives. The perspectives changed with the evolution of different paradigms and changes in policies, communications, and technologies. Role of communication had always been subject of extensive assumption in theories of development. Development communication find its origin in the disparity between the materialist development of the industrialized nation and the developing nations. There are several schools of thoughts considering communications as a vital infrastructure of the development process. Some viewed it as an important component for economic growth, whereas others viewed it as an integral part of the social transformation process and modernization. Exploration of the different approaches of development discloses the patterns of development communication and discontents in them. Analysis of the communication history reveals that during the 1920s, the state was the main agent of communication between different countries. With the evolvement of the social research tools, international communication scholars studied how the media was used by the states in the battlefields. Post the Second World War, US with its expanding firms became an enabler of the privatized capitalist markets. Scholars argued about the consequences of selling of news and information worldwide just like any other business product. The main concern raised was that of selling of news and entertainment in the form of commercial service would dominate the imagination of majority of the world population living in complete different situation. Further, the expansion of the local and the converged technological infrastructure had initiated new communication ways between non-government and non-profit organizations across different countries because of the limited infrastructure offered by state and corporates. Eventually, these alliances of the public interest groups have questioned the multinational and state-supported entities. Scholars claimed that the main purposes of international mass communication were established basically in social and political contexts during 1930s and 1940s. Interestingly, at the end of 1950s, the international communication studies that emerged were mostly US-centric. The earlier communication researchers assumed the purpose of communication in the context of war. With time, the concepts and theories of communication did not change even though the context changed. In the following, now in my presentation, we'll be discussing the theoretical perspectives of the international communication, the modernization theories supporting a steady economic growth were primarily concerned with the industrialized culture, where the notions of development were already institutionalized. Since theories do not explain the exact role of communication in the development process and consider it like any other element, we noticed how the colonization of the world took place after the Second World War, and out of the experience emerged certain dualistic theories focusing on the problems of the underdeveloped countries. Further, the alternative theories also, we observed that they focus on the balanced and unbalanced structures of north and south peripheries, demanded for substitute requirements for growth in nations with marginalized conditions. Theories emphasizing on human capital investment stressed on the education and literacy as the impetus for development, whereas entrepreneurial theories supported the role of economic elite. We know how the elite and developed class control the production and transmission of media content in the developing nations. Such biases in the form of knowledge gap and role of diffusion provide an insight about the failures of the modernization theory of development. The other approach, that is the Marxist approach of development, regarded communication as a fundamental yet not influential part of the development process. Differences in ideologies create the issue of class struggle, and the contemporary Marxist model take on the political, economic, and cultural ideologies when considering development. On the other hand, the elite and classified models emphasizes on the role of intellectuals, business and politically superficial classes in the process of social transformation, especially in the developing nations. Social mobilization concepts of development put emphasis on the communication policies and the role of participatory communications. It particularly focuses on the role of mass media in decision making, mass mobility, and social mobilization for development support. The diffusion supporters considered development process with the spread of innovation ideas. The diffusion approach stressed on material diffusion. As per McLuhan, each theory helps in determining the meaning of development communication, and that each historical era of development is characterized by the media used chiefly. So, development literature during the 50s and 60s suggests that mass communication have been pivotal agents of social development. By the 70s, the Third World Development Communication, researchers started to contest the style and pattern of the Western world dominated communication research. The evolution of alternate paradigm gave rise to the conceptualization of development support communication. Its main priority was to bridge the communication gap between the advantageous and the disadvantageous communities. It is an inevitable fact that every development situation has its own complexities and constraints, and the local level development effort is eventually inseparable from the wider global structures. In the present 21st century, the exponential growth of the information and communication technologies and globalization phenomenon has decreased the supremacy of any particular nation. In such a scenario, the nature of communication intervention has also undergone a change. To the global practitioners and theorists, development communication necessarily meant a dynamic factor vital for change and progress. We observed in our analysis of the different paradigms how the concept of progressive change had alterations in elements of participation and awareness of the individuals. The path of development that the dominant paradigm showed was to emulate the processes of industrialized world coupled with rejection of their traditions and customs which were considered archaic, conservative and opposing to development. Second World War has a major turning point after which international aids, interventions and beginning of modernization, planning and schemes developed. During the modernization phase of development, it was viewed that the third world nations should emulate the economic model of the Western industrialized world in order to modernize themselves. This modernization task was to be achieved by walking through 5 stages. The first stage was the traditional society. In order to reach the next stage, there were certain prerequisites such as political stability, which was essential for sustained economic growth as a third stage, and the fourth stage was that the maturity of economic and political institutions, which finally would pave way for the fifth and final stage, which was modernization characterized by high consumption rates and high rate of GDP. This transformation from stage 1 to stage 5 required new attitudes, progressive economic models, new work ethics, supportive public policies, etc., all of which were to be disseminated among the masses. Through the use of development communication, the dominant paradigm and its critiques, what we noticed that in the process of development under dominant paradigm, the indigenous styles, practices, culture, traditions were looked down upon and modern methods were viewed and presented as saving and uplifting the downtrodden sections of the society. This model emphasized that the new approaches of development were to be communicated to the larger audience through the use of mass media. The trickle-down theory of development communication rather created a knowledge gap between the haves and the have-nots. The modernization paradigm emphasized on transfer of media and communication infrastructure, and that created limitations in accessing media content in the third world nations. Urbanization, industrialization created problems of illiteracy and shortages of basic amenities. The modernization paradigm created increased dependency, and thus the alternative paradigm emerged. As per this paradigm, many of the ideas and strategies from the developed countries were taken and customized and fine-tuned to the needs of the people of the developing countries. The purpose was to improve the lives of the people, their communication and media habits, socio-political scenario of the nations, economic institutions, their culture, etc. Critiques of the modernization view of communication point out that during this phase, little attention was given to the contextual or sociological factors of development. Further, the communication process that was studied empirically was short-term and far too generalized. The diffusion of innovation research that was introduced in the dominant paradigm turned out to be deficient because of the uneven distribution of resources. the socio-cultural, political, and economic situations of the industrialized nations were very different from the countries of Asian and African continent. Yet, the diffusion model was uncritically advocated in the third world nations with the presumption that communication in any form can facilitate development, irrespective of the socio-cultural and economic situations. In most of the developing nations, extension support agents were in shortage and the support reached only to a fraction of people. Technological innovation was thought to be the solution for increased productivity regardless of thinking who would it benefit in the long term. In the subsequent dependency paradigm, the aspect of communication was characterized by a global approach. However, over the years, there has been an increasing skepticism with the modernization and alternative models of development. It is increasingly believed now that various nations of the world have their own geographical peculiarities, social setup, cultural blending, and have traced their own model of economic and social development which has suited their social and geographical setup. Disseminating a monotonous development model of any one part of the globe to various other parts via the channel of mass media basically disappointments the system of economic determinism and cultural imperialism. It also narrows the scope of developmental borrowings from any nation which is relatively small in size and economy to other nations comparatively large, both in geography and economy. It is here that the concept of internationalizing development communication finds its genesis to identify and appreciate the various developmental models across the globe to communicate its benefits to those parts which have previously been unaware of it. We notice that how the notion of development was weighed down with certain evolutionary biases. The development communication was linear and one-dimensional, majorly, and functioned along a certain predetermined sets of objectives. As indicated by modernization paradigm, economic growth was the major development indicator. Another theoretical bias could be observed in the UNESCO's suggested set of development indicators. According to these standards, every nation must have access to media and communication facilities. During the ongoing second and third decades of development, social structural growth was emphasized. Development theorists like Rogers argued about the necessity of social changes and communication significant for improving quality of lives. During this era, many of the underdeveloped nations have started to achieve the target of media access. But regrettably, the development communication history showed that having access to media facilities did not necessarily meant better communications or even equity or opportunities or improved cultural standards. Development communication indicators were found to be insensitive with the small traditional and personal modes of interactions or in the communities as they were thought to be not capable of bringing the desired social change. The emergence of big media like the radio and television depended on the commitment of government and fund availability. Further, the choice of communication indicated the model of development the nations were following consciously or unconsciously. What we understand from here is that the indicators of development communication served as the intermediary between the development theory and the development policies. New World information and communication order, as we understand it, as we observe that the focus of the international communication studies gradually shifted towards the mobilization of public opinion for national development. The modernization paradigm could also be well situated in the Cold War framework that articulated development goals for Russia and the developing countries of southern hemisphere. Communication was thought to be an enhancing factor for economic growth. Involvement of international organization had shifted the focus from communication as a publicity tool to a more institutionalized instrument of international politics. After the numerous critiques of the modernization paradigm, the notion of development communication was recast by practitioners in the context of developed and developing nations. Schramm argued about the international political communication influencing the mass media. In fact, four theories of press by Siebert and Peterson and Schramm also provided a conceptual framework of international communication in the Cold War. The emergence of the media research characterized by the Cold War instrumentality posed for broader debates concerning the economic development and power relations. Study by Nordenstern, Herbert Schiller, National Sovereignty and International Communication address the theoretic issues of the applicability of dependency model in the international communication. This particular study looked upon the role of broadcast satellites in the national sovereignty and the need for a balanced flow of news. It was in the 90s the report Many Voices, One World by Sven McBride was published as an outcome of the International Commission for Studying Communication Problems in the World. This report provided specifically an overview of the relations between communication and society and the international imbalances in the content and flow of information from the first to the third world. It initiated a debate in the sphere of international communication research and called for a new world information and communication order for enhancing professionalism of the media personnel and national sovereignty. It reflected the need for ensuring democratic communication rights and access to media of individuals. The 1980s were also considered as a crisis period of reflecting Western hegemony following the Cold War, increasing debt and decreasing development support. This period also marked the emergence of journalism, education, and international communication research focusing on telecommunications. Gaps were identified in the levels of accessing of telephones between nations. In other words, the holistic research on telecommunications offered an alternative approach for dealing with the issues of international communication approach. Developing nations also witnessed new sources of development aid and technological expertise. The main motive of the international communication exchange was to contribute to greater market economy and social integration in the less developed nations. The end of Cold War saw the emergence of many new nation states beginning in the 1990s. Development scholars and social scientists enlisted nation building and development projects. With information and communication technologies becoming an important part of the international trade and economy, economists jumped on the opportunity of open investments in technological services. Since the 1990s, the focus of international studies was primarily on the economic analysis. Apart from this, some scholars also raised the issue of complexities of relations between nation states and how social communication conditioned the international politics. Moreover, there also had been a shift in the UNESCO in studying that moved from international news flow to cultural communication. There have been shifts in the media industries in the international circle with more unions, partnerships, and acquisitions. There has been a growth of communication studies outside of Europe and America. Communication perspective of development. Also, we see scholars more and more try to engage with a critical development. Communication model is based on communication patterns involving information and feedback about the development strategies and programs. Theorists opined that communication perspectives on development viewed it as a structure of specific set of roles and patterns of actions through which social structures are modified. It is also true that the actions performed by people are defined by social conditions. If we try and analyze development from the communication perspective, then we may derive that many actions which are not defined as communication in its definitive sense are also a sort of communication efforts for development. We visualize development as a communication form and not any such particular economic or political process that gives less significance to communication factor. There is another perspective of communication in development, that is interaction process among planners and agents of change. The United Nations defined the decade of 1960 as the first decade of development and had set the economic targets for the underdeveloped nations. In the 1960s, the emphasis on development communication shifted on the technological transfer from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. It was the traditional communication practices in the developing countries that sustained for ages. Social structures in developing nations have undergone changes under the influence of different paradigms. It also implies that development communication strategies underwent changes, and in some phases they were successful and other times they were inappropriate. Development practitioners pointed about the components of sociological changes and improved cultural milieu for achieving growth in a community. The alternative paradigm emphasized on the social innovations for material growth. The main elements of development include proper administration, political leadership, and participation of masses by generating awareness. This lecture or this module has basically pointed out the different shifts in the international communication research from the post-World War II period till the 1990s, and the aspects of development communication was almost anticipated in every paradigm. That we mainly learned from this lecture that the theories of development give an insight of the perceived meaning of communication in different decades of development. The perspectives of development communication have changed, and not only because of different paradigms but also because of global changes in the social economic setup as well as communication and technological innovations. From this analysis of this international development literature, we can say that the notions of communications change with times, and different theories suggested ways of implementation of development strategies and efforts. So now in the conclusion, I would like to say attend all the questions in the quadrants and also refer to the third quadrant, and thank you.